So we've got the last session of the conference today. It'll focus on sustainability outcomes and what roles genetics plays in this. I think it's a good session to finish off. We've heard a bit about it in the panel session, so you'll get good insights into this now. And first up, we've got Sarah Strachan. She introduced herself just before, but she's MLA's Group Manager for Adoption and Commercialisation, which looks after genetics, producer adoption, MSA, and on-farm sustainability. So Sarah's going to cover off on our sustainability programs and the strong linkages along the supply chain through the selection decisions you can make. So please welcome Sarah to the stage.
Thank you, Clara. That's all good to go. Great, thanks. And thanks for letting me come back up here and share a little bit more information about our sustainability initiatives. This is a bit of a scene-setting presentation before we really get into some nitty-gritty detail with Daniel and others following me. And so where I wanted to start with today in this session is look at, well, what's the current environment that we believe that we're operating in? So I touched on earlier just about the importance of looking at consumer insights and being led by those insights. And so I wanted to expand on that a little bit more. I wanted to look at, well, what have we identified as this complex, there's a few complex challenges that we're jumping into as an industry, and I'm going to focus on that carbon neutral target, and then the role of genetics in meeting those expectations. So where I'm going to start is with the consumer, and having spent that time in MSA, as I mentioned earlier, consumer is king and has always been the centre of the room when we're trying to make a decision around what affects eating quality. And so this is sort of no different for anything when we're considering red meat production, is what is the consumer going to pay us for? How do we extract more out of the consumer? Because they are the actually only person in this whole story that puts money back into our supply chain for us to share down the supply chain. So how do we get them to pay more for our product, reward us for the credentials that we've got around that product, and keep them coming back all the time for red meat? Because it's very easy for them to walk over to another protein alternative and make a switch. So this picture up here is actually of a consumer in a European retail store that is actually holding a product up to the screen, and that screen is telling them about the credentials around that product. Now, it could be nutrition, it could be provenance of where it's been raised, it could be a whole lot of credentials. But the purpose here is that we've got a set of consumers. It's not everybody. Not everyone's looking to know absolutely everything about the piece of meat they buy. But there is certainly a growing market of consumers that are looking for that extra bit of information, and really that's where we see sustainability fitting in here. Now, we're in a pretty lucky position in Australia in that we've got hundreds of customers around the world, customers meaning countries, in that we're, in the whole scheme of things in the world, we're a really small producer of beef and sheep meat. We're a massive exporter though, and we're exporting over 70% of our product to over 100 countries around the world. Now this is to our advantage. We eat a lot of red meat here in Australia. We just don't have enough people to eat it all, so we have to send it overseas. But because we can be quite picky, we can put the right piece of meat in the right market, in the market that we know that's going to pay the most for it. So we're in a really luxurious position like that. However, we can't really rest on our laurels we have to make sure we maintain that market access as well, hence having things like integrity systems here today, because as soon as one of those markets shuts off, it actually has a really big impact on us as an industry. Now, we also can get really picky. We don't have enough product to actually feed the masses. There is well known there's a protein deficit around the world, but Australia is not going to be in the position to fill that. We're in a position to go and find the people that are willing to pay for our product. Now, if we just went and found where the population growth is, we'd put a lot of eggs in just a few baskets, and that's what this picture is up here, is that we would be sending most of our product into the rapid population growths in Asia, in particular, and the US and the EU are there as well. But they're not necessarily the customers that are going to pay more for Australian red meat. We're an expensive option in comparison to other countries around the world that are also in those markets. So what we can choose to do is go and find the consumers that have got disposable income to spend on our product. Australian red meat is considered to be a premium product in most markets. And so our trigger point we've worked out is that if a household has a disposable income of about $35,000 US a year, that looks to be the point where they will start purchasing Australian red meat or into that premium protein, or they'll make a shift to go into red meat as opposed to some other protein choices as well. Now that changes things if by the looks of this graph. There's still that growing population within some of those Asian countries, but all of a sudden we're spending a lot more time finding those customers in the US and the EU. And I just wanted to labour a bit on that EU-UK opportunity, because this year, as you've probably heard in the last couple of years since the UK and the EU separated, is that we've been negotiating some free trade agreements there. And in the one with the free trade agreement with the UK will come into effect this year. That is a $1 billion opportunity that we have not had since the 1970s for our red meat sector, and in particular lamb, or both species, but we've been limited to how much product we can send into the UK without getting, before we start triggering some tariffs being imposed on our products, so we become even more expensive in that market. This free trade agreement will actually mean that in the very first year, we absolutely get a massive increase in the amount of product that we can send to the UK. That jumps a lot by year 10 until it becomes completely liberalised. So without tariffs at all. Now the importance of this is that the UK is a really advanced market in the area of sustainability. It is a market, and the retailers within it are really powerful, and they are absolutely thinking about the products that they're putting on their supermarket shelves, what's their carbon footprint, what are the credentials that they've got, and their consumers are being driven to be thinking like that too. So that's why we're using these insights around what the market's telling us, is to know that we are on the right track about trying to achieve to become carbon neutral, and offering plenty of platforms for producers to prove that they've got those credentials as well. Now we're going to be in a perfect opportunity to take advantage of these things opening up for us, because the flock numbers are also forecast to be on the rise as well. So we'll see in the next year, we'll see the flock grow to a size that we haven't seen since 2007 it is. And what that also means is we have a growing flock size. We're also putting out more methane emissions and things like that too. So we absolutely have to be thinking about how do we do this, because any of this conversation around sustainability is not to be at the detriment of flock size. We want to keep growing flock size and our production volumes as well. But we're one of the only countries around the world that have actually got increasing flock size and herd size as well. Now New Zealand's one of our biggest competitors in the lamb market around the world, and they've got a decreasing flock size. So it's also an opportunity that we can start filling those gaps there as well. In the panel, I touched on some of the consumer insights we've seen in our shopper surveys that we do. Love watching how just general shoppers go about looking at red meat. It's a pretty confusing protein for them when they're standing in the supermarket shelf. They're trying to make a decision around that meal that night really quickly. And so what are the things they're thinking about? Now, as I said in that panel, sustainability, animal welfare, that's not the thing that they're thinking about when they're standing in front of the red meat category. But they are the things that they want to know that we're taking care of, because it doesn't make them feel guilty about buying lamb or beef. What they're thinking about when they're standing there is they're thinking about price. Without a doubt, that's absolutely one of the main drivers. They're thinking about freshness, and they're thinking about ease of use. And lamb, unfortunately, doesn't always tick that box of it's easy to use. And so hence we looked at Matt yesterday, looking at how do you make, in our marketing campaigns, how do we make sure lamb is seen as a product that you can eat every day of the week? It's really easy to use, and that's by putting the right cut in the right cooking method and making it really already prepared for them, so they're really successful when they go home with it. Most lamb consumers, most Australians are buying lamb, but they're doing that on a weekend, and they're doing it mainly for a dinner on a weekend, and they really see it as if you say, what do you think about lamb? One of the biggest things they'll say is it's delicious and it's comfort food. And so what we're trying to make them shift those, keep delicious and comfort food, but think of it, it's also an everyday meal, it's really easy to use as well. But when we ask them about sustainability, they do consider it to be important. When you prompt them and go, is sustainability important to you as a red meat shopper? Absolutely, over half of them will say it is. What's at the top of their mind, though, when they're thinking about sustainability is around food waste as well. So how do you limit food waste? How do we get better at recycling? But if you ask them, so is reducing your red meat consumption, are you considering that? That would be more sustainable? Absolutely not thinking that. So they're not thinking that they'll reduce their meat consumption to be more sustainable. They're really confident. Now, farmers are one of the most trusted occupations when we ask that of shoppers as well. So that's a great position to be in. And almost half of them are really confident that we're doing our very best to reduce our net emissions. And then also over half of them believe that if we can prove that we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to zero by to net zero, I should say by 2030, they would feel a lot more positive about the industry as well. So again, just leading into all these insights, going, okay, we're on the right track here, and we're ahead of what consumers are expecting of us. And so there are some early movers in this space. I spoke before about the power and the emergence of brands who are driving a story around their own product and really getting close to the consumer and trying to become a really loyal brand to that consumer. And so we've got 4 or 5 brands now in the Australian market that are using sustainability credentials with that. And they're all, they are validated claims that they're making. Coles is probably an example you might see. It started here in Victoria, the Coles Finest carbon neutral line, and it's starting to expand a bit further as well. But all of these brands will admit that the way that they're doing this right now is they are actually buying carbon credits to offset. So they've done their carbon accounting to know what their baseline emissions are and their carbon footprint, and putting in place initiatives to make sure their whole supply chain achieves a carbon neutral position. But in the interim, they're buying carbon credits to offset the surplus they've got to get that carbon neutral claim. Now, that is a legitimate methodology of being able to do that, but all of them are actually putting in place ways to actually get there themselves without having to rely on buying those offsets. As I mentioned, the retailers are really powerful in this space and can be very quick to... So it's really important we're really close with them. So they're not coming up with the stories themselves or the specifications they should put in place from producers without being really informed about what we do on farm as well. But we took a look at the retailers who have got sustainability goals themselves and who's advanced in this space around the world. And Australia and the US and the UK are probably leading the pack here, where they are absolutely most of the retailers are building in sustainability goals themselves within their own corporate commitments. And in particular, when I'm talking about sustainability here, I'm talking about which ones are looking at our emissions and how we're reducing those, who's interested in knowing whether we're carbon zero, net zero, and I've also got animal welfare there too. They're emerging in other countries, so on the other side where we've got some of the Asian countries and the Middle East, absolutely increasing in awareness there, but not as sophisticated as embedding it in their own goals and their own purchasing specifications of red meat. So really keeping an eye on that, because I'm a strong believer that once the power of the processing sector and the supermarket sector can really flow down to what our specifications will be on farm. So that's a bit of the scene of what we think the operating environment looks like and what we're trying to keep ahead of. Alan talked about complex problems yesterday as well, and just make a decision. And complex problems can be hard, but if you don't do anything, you sort of don't go anywhere either. So we've identified that what I really mean is the red meat industry at large has identified some pretty big, complex problems to sink our teeth into. MLAs and the red meat sector's got a fair role to play here in achieving it. But we've made some decisions and we're just getting on with it. We're having a crack at attacking some of these complex challenges. And so they're in sort of 4 groups. If you were to look up the industry plan of what are we going to achieve by 2030, sort of there's 4 buckets of activities, if you like, and that is, how do we double the value of the red meat sales coming out of this country? And I won't spend time on that today, but with hearing things like the technologies and grading systems and carcass utilisation, that's all about that stuff. And then how do we become the most trusted source of the highest quality protein when we do double the value of those sales getting out of this country? Integrity Systems Company absolutely plays a fundamental role there as well. How do we support producers to put in place practices that help them achieve this? We're going to do that by doubling the investment in adoption. So doubling the investment in the support, tools, resources for producers to test some of this stuff out, de-risk having a go at some things by getting producer groups going together. And then achieving carbon neutrality is seen as a real success indicator of that plan as well. And so that's where I'm going to jump into now as to what does that CN30 target actually mean and what are we doing about it? Because as I said, we're cracking on. We're going to have a crack at it, and it's certainly been a big focus for us at MLA. So the CN30 target was set in 2017, as you may recall. MLA got up at the AGM at that year and said we're going to help support the industry become carbon neutral, because we had done some modelling with the CSIRO that helped inform us that this is achievable and certain pathways to get there. Now, what it's net zero, it's really important to understand what net zero means. It doesn't mean we're going to reduce all of the methane emissions out of the industry. That's unrealistic. But we're absolutely going to do our best to find ways to see if we can reduce them. But there's going to be some left over. So to offset that and to get this into zero position is we're going to look at ways to improve the sequestration of carbon through soil and vegetation. So that's the two parts of the equation. And it's also important to know it's an industry level goal to become carbon neutral. So it's not requiring every single producer to become carbon neutral themselves. Absolutely opportunities for producers to do that, and there may be supply chains that would actually like you to do that as well, and there could be financial opportunities for you doing that yourself. But when we get to 2030 and we'll see, did we make it, it'll be an aggregated method that we're using to work out whether we did that. And that's been based off, in 2000, CSIRO have helped develop that, or have developed that methodology to determine whether we get there or not. And they established a baseline in 2005 in line with the Paris Agreement that we're working off to know if we're making progress each year. So far, we've got a great story to tell, because since 2005, our sector, the red meat sector, has been able to reduce its greenhouse emissions by nearly 60%. Now, most of that has actually come from, there's a few things contributing to that. A large part of that is changes in vegetation laws, particularly in Queensland. But it certainly has changed the way that we're managing some land. Our flock sizes and herd sizes have been contracting, and they'll start to increase as well. And so they're contributing here as well. But we have certainly seen the goal of being carbon neutral by 2030, in my observation, is that it's created a real sense of urgency, not just in MLA, but in the whole of industry, and a whole lot of commercial investment as well in how do we accelerate getting there. And it's been pretty impressive. And so the investments we're making in looking at the research we need to do for carbon neutral, most of that is not even using a single producer levy. So remember that we're using producer levies to invest in research and marketing. We've got $140 million through MLA invested in how to become carbon neutral, and a tiny, tiny little bit of that has used a producer levy. It's because there's so much interest in the commercial and research organisations in wanting to partner in this area as well, that we've actually got a mechanism through MLA to match funding with those commercial investors as well, and that's how we're going about it. It's ambitious. It's absolutely an ambitious goal, and we've been spending some time in the countries like the UK and the US and recently who are wanting to know more about this, and they absolutely think we're being very ambitious. They know all about it. However, we do think it is achievable, because when we look at the size of Australia, we've got over 50% of the land is in the custodianship of livestock producers. It's a huge carbon sink opportunity as well. There is less than 8% of the land viable to use for anything but livestock production in those areas as well. So we see this as a huge opportunity, especially for soil carbon storage, that we've got a massive landscape to work with. The other thing that's a really impressive, I believe, for Australia is that it's being industry-led and it's voluntary. This has not come through any government regulation, and we absolutely would love to try and avoid ever getting down that path. You may be well aware that New Zealand has gone down the path of putting in place methane tax in New Zealand. What that has done is actually absolutely accelerated the adoption of carbon accounting tools. Because 95% of producers there, I'm told, now know exactly what their carbon account is. So I think policy can do that. It can drive practice change. But we'd ideally like to stay away from having government step in and feel like they have to put in place those things on us. Because we want to demonstrate that we're being really proactive here and we've got this under control and we'll get on with it. We're not subsidised here in Australia either. We've got less than 5% of farm income comes through any type of government subsidy, whereas we've got European countries like Norway that have got 60% of their farm income is subsidised as well. So it looks a really positive story to tell around this and that we're all in this together. Now to explain what are we doing around achieving this target, we've broken it into 4 work areas. Emissions avoidance is probably the biggest work area right now. The last couple of years we've worked on just getting in place research that we think needs to be happening to come up with new technologies, new interventions that might help reduce methane emissions. And then we're just kicking into a stage now where we're really going to increase our adoption efforts. So whilst the research is now well and truly underway and some outputs will start to come out of that really soon, now we'll start working with very much putting in place some resources I'm going to show you at the end, in that producers can now really get involved. And the thing is, we can actually get started on this stuff now. We don't have to wait for new fancy technologies to come out. There's heaps of things we can do right now with the tools and the knowledge we've got, especially around genetics, and getting started on that. But emissions avoidance, probably the one big chunk of that work is looking at livestock supplements that can actually reduce the amount of methane coming out of an animal's mouth. 5 minutes? Okay. And so that's a big part of that. So you might have heard of the seaweed, and there's also a synthetic form of that as well. Looking at their legume varieties that could be also methane inhibitors. And genetics absolutely is one of the areas you'll hear about, that we've got big investments in, on ideally having breeding values down the track that are about low methane emitting animals. Carbon storage is the next part of that equation. So looking at mainly trees, things like time-controlled grazing, deeper fertilising regimes. Are there different, again, pasture varieties that sequester more carbon as well? Supporting this is a whole bunch of accounting frameworks. There's lots of options out there for producers to get involved in on how to come up with your carbon account. But ideally, we want to make those as consistent as possible. And then putting in place some tools and resources that producers, advisors, consultants can get involved in and get started. Now, I guess what's the role of genetics here? And I'm only going to briefly touch on this because Daniel will get right into the detail. But where I see it is, we don't have to wait until some of these things become available, or new breeding values, because there are plenty of traits right now that you could be putting selection pressure on that would actually take us down this sustainability road and basically reducing emissions intensity. So how do you reduce the amount of emissions for the amount of kilos that you're turning off? Looking at how do you reduce wastage through the system as well, so improving lamb survival and reproduction traits as well. But in a few years' time, hopefully we have breeding values that absolutely complement all of this as well and are directly related to how much methane does that animal produce, or likely its progeny to produce. And so just on Daniel's going to get into more detail about the actual projects, but about 15% of our investment in this area of reducing emissions is actually around genetics and how we're going to come up with those breeding values. So there are financial opportunities in all of this for producers. It's not just about creating carbon credits. We think about 20% of producers might benefit for coming up with carbon credits that you can sell in the carbon market. But absolutely that's something that you would enter into and make sure you're understanding that completely before you jumped into that space too. But the productivity gains, just by looking at how do we improve our emissions intensity, so how do we turn off animals at a heavier weight, at an earlier rate as well, that reduces our emissions intensity, also has a huge amount of productivity gains there as well. And how do we optimise the amount of carbon that is cycling through our agricultural system as well? It's such a natural cycle that's also in our advantage, because we've worked out is that the amount of methane that an animal actually is generating just from grazing, in sheep, it actually equates to about 30 grazing days a year because it's an energy being generated by that animal. So if we can divert that energy through either reducing with an additive or just being a bit more efficient in those animals, diverting the energy of methane production into live weight gain, also getting those productivity gains there too. Won't spend time on this, but the other financial opportunities are there's going to be markets and there's going to be supply chains that are going to ask for your credentials in this area too. So it potentially becomes a market access opportunity to jump inside one of those supply chains, and the carbon market's also there as well. So finally, just some resources that I think I've alluded to in the booklet, but I'd really encourage you to go and check out, is there's now some e-learning stuff on our website, which is Carbon 101. Just get your heads around what does this actually mean, how could I get started right now. There's a whole catalogue of things that we've got in place that you can get your hands on right now to just get started on all these productivity areas that I was talking about. An exclusive for this group, just released yesterday, was the carbon calculator. Now, if I can encourage you to do nothing more but go and have a look at that when you get home. Really important that it'd be really great if you could establish your baseline as soon as possible. Because the other thing to go and have a look at is what is the data you need to get to a baseline? Because you maybe have some gaps in that data. I mean, as a leading breeder group, you've probably got data coming out your ears. But it's really good to go and know what data would you need to get a carbon baseline. And you want to do that as soon as possible, because if you start putting interventions in place like tree planting, sometimes you can't count that down the track if you haven't already set your baseline as well. So if anything else, please go and check that out. And there'll be some more workshops. So our Edge Network brand of products is developing a carbon workshop, and that'll be released later this year also. I guess just in summary, it's really, I think, really important that we've got this CN30 target, but it absolutely needs to be a productivity and profitability discussion first and foremost. And we'll just get by being really focused on how do we even get more efficient, more productive, we'll end up with those environmental co-benefits happening as well, and we'll absolutely be on the right track. And we can get started right now, and hopefully in the next couple of years, we're also going to have some pretty neat technologies and tools you can put in place that'll get us there even faster. So thanks, Clara. I'm happy to take any questions on that.
Thanks, Sarah. We've had a couple of good questions come through, but we've only got time for two. So I think there's two really good ones here. The first one is collaboration is key, which we heard from Alan Ryan yesterday. What collaboration are we doing across animal protein RDCs to tackle some of these complex problems?
Yeah, that is a really good one, because there's no competition here as to who's going to be carbon neutral the first. Not very good grammar. The quickest. So we are absolutely working with other RDCs. One in particular, AWI we work with. In particular, I'm in a lot of conversations with GRDC right now. So many of our stakeholders are mixed farming enterprises as well. The carbon calculator that's just been released, it does look at sheep and beef enterprises, but it's got a grains element there too. So you can come up with a whole farm system carbon baseline. So we have got a number of projects where we're working together. Dairy Australia is another group, but also globally, there's, as I said, it's not a competition because we actually want to keep red meat on the menu everywhere in the world. So this is almost like a global good initiative as well that we've got. There's lots of interest around the world to partner up on it too.
Thanks, Sarah. And the last question here is, and you've touched on a little bit, what advice would you give a producer that wanted to get started in understanding where their business sits in relation to carbon emissions?
So as I mentioned, there are some tools that you can get your hands on really quickly. As soon as you walk out this door and get home tonight, you can get started with what's freely available on the MLA website. I think what's become quite evident to us is just the importance of having some localised knowledge maybe helping you with that too. We've got a number of producers that are producer groups that are forming around this topic, and we're like-minded producers wanting to test out some stuff and be really open book with sharing doing carbon accounts together and sharing that information and working out, well, what are the levers each of us could pull and so on, and test some of that out. What seems to be a really critical part to that is having someone like a consultant or an advisor that's local with local knowledge around what the opportunities are, because not every soil is going to have the same soil carbon capture opportunity, but having localised knowledge, I think is really important as support for that.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah, and yeah, very good session from an MLA perspective.
Great, thank you.